we'll have Steve Russell.
I was adding things up, and it turns out that I worked for John longer than I've ever worked for anyone else. About almost 9 years, I believe. And I'm really indebted for the opportunities it provided. I got to do a number of things that were first, turned out to be first in the world, and I got a lot of adventures along the way. In the process, especially of setting up the PDP-1 time-sharing system and the PDP-6 time-sharing system, I learned a great deal about system reliability and about those arrows. Those systems didn't start out very reliable, and we managed, by considerable effort, to make them more reliable and get them to work adequately. But along the way, a large number of people informed me very clearly when things were not adequate. The first thing I did for John was become a compiler. John had, in his engineering, wearing his engineering hat, had figured out short sequences of instructions to implement pieces of Lisp, which he was beginning to think about in 1958. And so I had started hand compiling pieces of Lisp, and then a couple of months into the semester, John figured out the universal S expression. And I looked at it and said, oh, I know how to do that, and started working on it. John later on felt that I had perhaps rushed things. But anyway, we got an interpreter that worked. And then Jim Slagle explained how he was going to use it. And I realized it didn't work. And so we fixed it up. And I wrote the world's second Lisp interpreter, which worked much better. Then there's the time-sharing systems. One of the things that I did as a midnight project at MIT was tinker with the PDP-1. And that was an interactive computer that allowed symbolic debugging. And I and John became convinced that this was a much better way to use computers than the card systems, which some of you fondly remember. And so John set about arranging to do that and proposed ways to do it and got the support for the PDP-1 time-sharing system at Stanford. And I had a lot of adventures getting that to work, but it turns out it was the prototype for the modern way of using computers. You have a display, you have a keyboard, you have extra buttons on the keyboard, and it acts like you have a computer all to yourself. And so I'm extremely grateful for those opportunities. And I'm also very appreciative of John's management style. One of his talents was to disappear. So you'd catch him in the hall and have a conversation, start a conversation, and somebody else would join in. And all of a sudden, John was gone. So thank you, John. We'll miss you.
Thanks, Steve. That's a record for timeliness.